Right, welcome to week 4. Our topic for this week is the Zoom session on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. And I must confess, while I was trying to upload the Zoom session, it seems that obviously we've had some system issues down south and the system is not uploading in the way that I hoped it would. So I'm unable to retrieve the actual file. So this is, again, a stand-in lecture for the Zoom session. So I'm just going to elaborate some of the points and some of the questions that came from the floor. So we began with Noel Pearson, and again his reflection on the soft bigotry of low expectations. What we do as teachers really does make a difference in our classroom and really does make a difference to the outcome of our students. Okay, so looking at our next slide. Okay, the weekly introduction. I won't say too much about this. One of the questions that did come from Kaylee in the session this morning was about where the Kids Matter website was located. Now I'm going to post that for you in the subject forum, so please keep an eye out for that. But we talked about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, and James G. coined the term discourse. Discourse, of course, is a worldview, a way of seeing the world. And of course we have a capital D discourse for large groups of people. There's a Muslim discourse, there is an Aboriginal discourse, and then we've got the small d discourses, for instance, where rappers and goths and a whole range of different groups of people may reside. And these circles are interwoven, of course. The Aboriginal perspective is something that recognises and values culture and identity. And I've posted the Kids Matter website, and the reason I've done that is because it actually connects the Australian Psychological Society with the Kids Matter animators and producers of animation videos who are all Indigenous. And what it does is bring together a storytelling culture built around the principles of resilience and engagement. So it's a really good example of how teaching resources can look, in particular when we get later in the week, when we start to consider the ways of knowing that we're talking about, that Lev Vygotsky would have identified as the tools we will use, the pedagogical tools we would use to connect with Indigenous learners in what he called the zone of proximal development. So, that's what we've got to hang and focus on here, is those ways of knowing. The third point of this entire week was that science should be taught in ways that recognise the influences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the perspectives and the way they learn. And of course, that is one of the ACS curriculum priorities. In fact, it's the first listed. And of course, it's also one of the assessment task criteria for this week's, for your first assessment item during week 6. The learning outcomes: explain, describe, analyse. And as you can see, we're talking about explaining culture and scientific knowledge in a cross-cultural format. So it's not just about us crossing the floor to Indigenous cultures and saying, okay, let's take your primitive science and let's redefine it. What we're actually saying is we have one parallel form of science in Indigenous and traditional science. We have a second in form of Western positivist sciences. The two are now parallel. The two now complement each other. And ACARA has gone to great pains to embed this in its new curriculum frameworks. So no longer is Indigenous science a poor cousin. And this is global, right across the world. Canada, American, North Indians, and New Zealand. We can go to any First Nations people, particularly also in Asia and Japan. First Nations people, the old ways are integrating with the new. What were so-called the old sciences are now starting to inform the new. And we're all sitting on that cultural precipice where we're stepping across to include old cultures. Old cultures are opening up to include new. So it's a mutual exchange process. And so we also need to describe how this can be planned and designed as a curriculum area. How these views, particularly in Aboriginal Indigenous views, can be brought into the planning, design, delivery of science teaching. And finally, we're going to look at the 8 Aboriginal Ways of Learning and the particular framework document there. My thanks to Katie, who used the forum to actually push a question to let me know that the link wasn't working to that PDF. That link is now working, so you will be able to access the 8 Aboriginal Ways of Learning. That could be really good information for your first assessment task, because one of the criteria is about how you will include Aboriginal perspectives. Our key terms: diversity, Indigenous, Aboriginal education. Have a working definition of each of those so that you can actually tap into them and use them when you need them. I posted up a little example of something I'd done with Indigenous kids that began in a very different place. I was using robotics, largely, I was working with autistic kids, kids with disabilities, intellectual impairment. I was also working with the CEOs of large organisations. And we were using play-based learning as a way to build teams, to build synergy, to build energy, to build understanding, to bring people together with, a range of skills. And have a look at this quote from Crawford. It's one of my favourites. It goes back to 1982. And Crawford talks about games as being the most ancient and time-honoured vehicle for education. And the reason why I share this is because a lot of Indigenous culture and learning is built around, the ways of knowing are built around game playing. They're original educational technology. We don't see mother lions lecturing cubs at the chalkboard. We don't see lions writing their memoirs for posterity. Can games be educational value? Okay, of course they can. It's schools that are the newfangled notion, the untested fad, the violator of tradition. Game playing is a vital educational function for any creature capable of learning. Now, I've put this particular example up. It began with a global challenge. As you can see, we held it up here in the far north. It was global as well. Students had to bring together their technical and mathematics, science, technology, engineering skills to the particular problem of the global shortage and crisis in power that we were facing. The challenge was fun. It involved robots. It involved a whole range of problem solving. From that, of course, it's caught on, it's become national. It's now embedded in 7 different universities and involves, 350,000 kids globally and has 8,000 participants every year in Australia. But we're seeing a lot of, focus on engineering. So the STEM curricula is growing particularly strong. And so robotics actually help to enforce that particular career. And down here, of course, Lego, believe it or not, have actually a P to 12 curricula for robotics, which touches on everything from simple systems to complex systems. So the impact of robots is quite profound across the curriculum. Now the challenge for us was how to be more inclusive. Because let's face it, girls generally didn't love robots that much. Minority cultures didn't love robots that much. So we created a robot dance challenge. And of course we had Mexican robots, we had Spanish robots, and we included in that, of course, was an Indigenous robot. The boys built it, 4 young men built it out of black Lego, and it contained the traditional colours of the Jabberkai people, and it performed kangaroo dance while 2 of the young men actually sat beside it playing didgeridoos, and of course the 3rd young man using the sticks to actually promote its movement and the music and cultural integration. So we can see that this amazing fusion of science, science from different worlds coming together to actually tell this incredible and powerful story of the kangaroo and its birth and conception, and ultimately of why it is what it is. So essentially it was biological sciences in the biological science strand, and of course the elaborations could be built around that for a teaching task. The Science Fair Station, be sure to connect with the ACS when you're doing this task this week. It's really important, and this is also very, very good practice for Assessment Task 1. You can't really complete Assessment Task 1 without naming where you sit in the curriculum. And a really good question we had here is, should I actually be naming a year level? And the answer to that, my recommendation is yes. Be as specific as you can when you complete Assessment Task 1. Identify your scientific strand, whether it's biology, earth science or space science. Identify the year level and state clearly your elaborations and the inquiry skills that you're actually be focusing upon. Byron Lester did a great example when he came through, and thanks Byron for having the courage to post it and doing all the good work you've done. He picked up on the ACARA website, the Earth and Space Sciences substrand, and looked at Earth's dynamic structure and place in the cosmos. And he explored a lot of ideas around that and stated clearly the elaborations there. He picked up on Year 1 content descriptors for Earth science and space, and he's focusing on the observable aspects. Really important when you start to look at the task he designs. The changes occur in the sky and landscape, and he linked it to the relevant standard, Standard 19. His task was basically to have a look at why the sun rises and why the moon also rises. except at different times of day. And clearly, Byron can see the connection here to the Indigenous Dreamtime stories and to alternative or complementary scientific explanations of why this might happen. So great work, Byron. Joe Sambono, Principal Officer with DEET, also does an elaboration here, and I have included the hyperlink to that down at the bottom of the page, the source for Joe's presentation. He talks about embedding Indigenous perspectives into resources to support the implementation of the Australian curriculum. And he says, why do we do it in this second slide? And basically, it's to deepen our own knowledge by interacting with the world's oldest culture. And this culture also can continue its ongoing development by interacting with us. And the 4 sub-themes that Joe identifies: reconciliation, positive identities, hidden histories and facts, and greater educational outcomes for Indigenous students. Now, if you go back to the Kids Matter website, you'll see that all of those 4 principles are embedded in that website. And they're actually spoken about by the people who've designed the animations and tasks. So Joe Sambono, if you do have time this week, I know you're busy. If you do have time, flick through his presentation. It's also very good for the Pecha Kucha because it's about 28 slides long and it gives you an idea of the sorts of techniques you might want to employ in putting your own together for assessment task 1. Joe also continues to raise the question of Aboriginal education. Exactly what is it? And science as an Indigenous perspective or concept has been open to conjecture and debate for a long period of time. Is it seriously a science? Well, ACAR has made every statement to say yes it is. As a matter of fact, first world nations and first world sciences across the globe are now being accepted and welcomed into the mainstream frameworks. Sometimes it's seen as easier science and simplistic, and yet the complexity of the myths are quite outstanding when we do analyse them. Joe goes to great points to state here that things are changing. Indigenous ways are progressively being more recognised and more inclusive. And we know this because when we talk about educating Aboriginal students, we're talking about a dual face here, an interface, because we're working with that subculture of students itself, but we're also working with the mainstream. We are trying to create a dynamic dual cultural exchange process where mainstream students are learning more about traditional sciences and traditional students are learning more about mainstream sciences. What we're going to finish up is an eclectic heuristic, a bridge between cultures, where the real winner will be the learner and the sciences. It's an interesting and exciting phenomenon. As a matter of fact, the Indigenous perspective is one of ACARA's 3 priorities. And Joe Sambono goes on to identify, for instance, a couple of examples where he looks at foundation year descriptors and talks about earth and space sciences. And across that earth and space science field, he can map all of the substrands using Indigenous science and Indigenous scientific principles. Traditional scientific principles. Now you'll hear terms like TEK, T-E-K, traditional ecological knowledge. It is now a new area of science. And all around the globe, traditional technologies, traditional ecologies are dealing with issues created by modern industrialisation. They're being reapplied as scientific methodology. Again, here is a strong statement from Joe about just how integrated, how possible it is to integrate the F10 framework using Indigenous perspectives. So why don't we do it? Chris Garner comes up with some answers. Because we try to test everybody using the same exam. And this little cartoon depicts that scenario. They're about to climb the tree. The elephant, the penguin, the goldfish in particular are going to struggle. The seal perhaps, the dog will make some attempt, but the monkey will thrive. Is this really a statement about the education system we create? Chris Garner says it is. Now, Chris Garner was a young South African teacher, and he walked into a classroom in the Northern Territory, and he actually wasn't a teacher. He came to Australia to train as a teacher, had a look at what was happening to Indigenous people here, became outraged, and then went to the Northern Territory to work in remote areas as a teacher. He walked into the classroom and the first thing he saw was the dichotomy, the split between what Indigenous students need and what they get. We were dealing up and serving up, says Chris, this old ancient method of potential by effort equals success, the old Protestant work ethic, the old middle class education model. You know, if we've got resources and we come from good families and we put in the effort, then, you know, we should at least get as far as our fathers got. Good old model that. Chris says, I'm sorry, that doesn't work for Indigenous people. What we've got is potential by effort, but that must be relevant to their own context in order to get success. Chris actually goes on to say that we are trapped in Western ideologies. And this is one of the reasons why we need to integrate, from his perspective, traditional perspectives. And he goes on to tell his story in pictures. Have a look at this one. 40% of Indigenous kids stay at school. 76% of non-Indigenous. Here's what we're talking about when we discuss closing the gap. Here in the second slide, we have a look at 6 years into Chris's longitudinal study. He's got a program running in his Northern Territory school called Teaching to Context, relevant to context. So everything he does, from maths, science, literacy, you name it, even health and education, are all done in a context relevant to the Indigenous learner, the Indigenous student, the Indigenous community, and the Indigenous local understandings and customs. So he's gone to great pains to build this in. His teaching team and colleagues have built this in. The local community teach into this program. And we've seen in 6 years a substantial increase in school retentions, from 40 to 58%. Down here, graduation levels, 32% to Year 12 in the Northern Territory for these students. Non-Indigenous, 71%. After Chris's program, have a look at the students in his cohort. After 6 years of exposure, 6 years of data analysis, they have a 96% retention rate because they are teaching to Indigenous context. That's a very, very powerful story. Powerful enough for a Kara to get it, powerful enough for us to get it and to implement it. So in the Kids Matter activity, where you had to identify a website or identify resources or some reasons why this benefits, this approach to context actually benefits teaching and learning. I've actually put a link to this article by the Australian Psychological Society, and they got together with the Kids Matter group, and they produced these wonderful 12 videos about resilience, about the community, about value, and about storytelling. And as you can see, they are a step in this right direction. Okay, relevant to context. Okay, and the APS, the Australian Psychological Society, wrote a short article explaining the well-being, the health, the psychological and the educational benefits of an approach like this. So it's a very, very fabulous initiative, and if you've got time, have a read of that article. It will take you probably 3 or 4 minutes at most. It's a short one. Activity 3 was the poster task. And again, a bit of a strange task, this one. I didn't set this task. I can't claim credit for it. But what it does, it actually sends you to the CSIRO to have a look at what's happening from our perspective about luring Indigenous perspectives, inviting Indigenous perspectives into mainstream society. And we can see here we've got certain pathways, the science pathways, for targeting rural and remote kids at primary and middle school level. We've got inquiry for Indigenous science students, again, middle school students in mainstream metropolitan. And here's the difference. Chris Garner's doing wonderful work in a remote area of Northern Territory. He can, because out there teachers suddenly realise they're on their own. They're a little bit freer. In urban schools, however, we are very still much addicted to a dual curricula for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. We're still comparing performance under the one curricula. We're not identifying and differentiating needs. So in our urban schools, teachers are very much stuck, married, welded to Western ideologies, to curriculum frameworks that they can't avoid. The Prime Futures, is about retention, about getting kids in middle school through to higher school. The Bachelor of Science is about getting kids from high school into Melbourne University. They may not have the correct OP score or the entry score, but they may come in via alternative programs or do an extended course. The Indigenous STEM Awards acknowledges that there are many Indigenous scientists and Indigenous community scientists out there championing the Indigenous cause. This is a network for professionals, and you can see it's bringing together a professional community, a community of practice around some of these other scientific pathways. And finally, we've got the schools of excellence. We're promoting actually science innovation. So we've got the full continuum here. You know, the CSIRO are doing a lot to try and promote and embed Indigenous approaches to science. The 8 Aboriginal Ways of Learning. The PDF link to this is actually fixed for you now, and it's a really important one. Now, Lev Vygotsky talked about the zone of proximal development. And teachers, that's all we have to work with. We have to identify that zone. There is no point us standing out the front lecturing to a group of students who don't want to participate or engage with that. There's one of two things. They can elect an identity of participation and become a student, or they can elect identity of non-participation and work really hard at not being a student. And either way, they're working really hard. But one set of outcomes is going to deliver good results and the other set is not. So non-participation is something we have to challenge. And the ways of learning, the ways of knowing, is one framework for doing that. Chris Garner asks, why is it that we want to treat all students fairly? Why do we assess them on the exact same activities? Isn't that a contradiction? Why do we impose the same expectations on every child? What if we could simply make schooling relevant to every kid in the class, if we would design activities that made sense to their real life? And that means building on community links. Deconstructing what literacy means, what numeracy means, what science means from a Western perspective, and reconstructing it from an Indigenous perspective, and then stepping into our own classrooms and deconstructing our Western society's understanding of science and reconstructing it in Indigenous terms. Knowledge is non-linear in Indigenous communities. We have hierarchies of knowledge. You know, go to the library, do this, do that. We have a Dewey Decimal System. Knowledge in Indigenous communities is not linked in that way. It's non-linear. It's embedded in people. It's generational. It's embedded in a rock or a tree, which is a symbol. We go down here to symbols and images. We've got land links and symbols. They go together. Non-verbal. How often do we see Aboriginal people dancing stories? It's non-verbal communication. It's a huge component of the culture and, of the evolution and science behind it. And of course, learning maps. We have textbooks, we have Moodles, we have websites. Indigenous people have country. Now, around that country, if you're ever privileged and invited into that circle, you can see as a way of learning that everything in that country is a learning artifact. It represents something, it represents a connection, it represents an elaboration, it represents a warning, it represents a food source. Okay, it's an extremely powerful learning map. This is a complex science. Chris Garner goes on to show, again in his model, that context has got everything. It's about building competence, social competence, and what Randall Pinkett in 2003 would have called socio-cultural constructivism. He can build, it is possible through teaching, to have a model of constructivism, Vygotsky, 1921, that can actually build socio-cultural competence. And here's what Chris Garner talks about. 33% of Indigenous students were employed post-school, okay, and at 2011 when his project started, 2010, sorry. 71% non-Indigenous, there is a gap. But when, in his community, when they began to teach relevant to context, almost 3 times the increase, 98% employment in school. In other words, the learners know their place in the community. They have their elders. They know what they're going to do. They know the demands and the rigour of the tasks they're going to perform. They have the competency sets to perform them because they've learnt them in context. So the first thing that strikes me, says Chris Garner, is that we have a set of standards, and it is fair that when we personalise the program for every student, that we somehow lower the standards. In other words, do teachers have fear personalising the curriculum? Are we a rebel in our own lunchbox? Can we be construed as being negligent of the curriculum frameworks and ACARA standards. Well, to some degree, ACARA have addressed this. They've actually invited Indigenous perspectives into the framework. On the other hand, it still takes a teacher's personal courage to make that leap. And that brings us to our discussion board this week. Okay, we need to see some postings. Here's, if you want to watch Chris Garner's video, I've posted the link for you here. But a video, a student who was involved in his program writes back to Chris a thank you note. Because we are Aboriginals, we come from different backgrounds and have different culture and law. Our path is set in circles because of who we are and where we come from. The path for this year will get us towards our goals and dreams. All I'm saying is I'm glad you and others had the time to look and made a change. What change can you make on this week's discussion board? Really important that you give this one a go because, as I said, in assessment task number 1, you are going to be asked, you're going to be assessed, it's one of the main criteria. Have a look at the breakdown of marks. You're going to be asked to demonstrate an Indigenous perspective. So why not do it here? Look at one of these. Do it in an environment on the discussion board where you can get feedback and where nobody gets hurt, nobody dies, no one gets bruised. Okay, it's really all about feeding back and doing a dummy run, a practice run. Because have a look at these curriculum tasks and have a look at how you may add and bring that perspective in. And I do encourage you to look at Joseph Boro's stuff as well because he's got some good ideas on how you might do that. As I said, my favourite here is the one with astronomy and the Greeks. I like the bush gardens one, the bush foods. But please have a look at, there's a whole range of good activities here. Pick one. You don't have to work it to death, but you do need to tease these concepts through because you are going to be assessed on them in 2 weeks' time. A couple of comments from the forums this week. Uploading the Pecha Kucha, there's no need to upload the transcript, just a PowerPoint slideshow. Okay, pretty clear on that. Keep a transcript if you've got one up your sleeve, just in case your file corrupts at the last minute. At least you can recover aspects of what you need to do and submit that as evidence of you having done it. So it's always good to have a backup. But the transcript does not need to be submitted. I had a student send in this second point. I understand the strands and their elaborations, but don't quite know how you're wanting it explained as we have limited slides and a few areas to justify. Is it best to elect a year level? Sure, I'm just overthinking, but if you could simplify, I'd be very grateful. My inclination is yes. Do nominate a year level. Do nominate a strand. Do nominate a substrand. Do nominate a year level. Make it specific. So when the marker goes there, they know what they're looking for. So you're going to have 20 slides. Do a storyboard. We talked about that in the Zoom session this morning. A storyboard is simply 20 bits of paper. On that 20 bits of paper, plan your content. Which one you're going to put where. For instance, am I going to need 3 slides for an introduction and 3 slides for a conclusion? That means I've got 14 slides to do my content, to paint my pictures and tell my story. Okay, let's start with that. Let's draw my introduction. What would the first slide need to be? What's the second? Okay, by slide 3, I need to have established my curriculum areas. Slide 4, if I'm doing the 5 E's, as one student on the forum this morning said she was, okay, I may introduce the first of the 5 E's. That's going to give me at least 2 slides on each of the E's. It's going to give me 2 slides to integrate them, 3 slides to introduce the presentation, 3 slides to conclude it. There is your rough storyboard. Go to work on it. Brainstorm it. Okay, sketch it out. Even share it with someone else. See what they're doing. But I would certainly nominate a year level and a clear focus. We know your strands are already settled. It has to be biology, earth or space science. The rest is up to you. Question number 3, reference in the Pecha Kucha. Again, you've got 20 slides. If you've got references, and you should have references, sources from where you've got your pictures, etc., just create extra slides. They don't count in your word count. Okay, just include them. And if you're using direct quotes throughout your presentation, just put the name of the person, and in your references, cite where you got that direct quote from. Okay, it's really important. You don't want to fill your screen full of text and people's names in a Pecha Kucha. It's a different genre. It's a very visual one. But if you're using quotes, for instance, from Albert Einstein, or quotes, for instance, from James Hillman or other scientists like them, then, put the quote in, or state it, narrate it, and throw the author's name in, and in your references include a direct link to them. Okay, so sorry to move through this so quickly. We did have some discussions about this morning, but as I said, I've got a 400 megabyte file that's not downloading from Townsville and not allowing me to publish it. So a couple of examples to finish here, and these come actually from Sam Saboro's presentation, where we look at forms of energy can be transferred through a variety of ways and mediums. Here's a lovely example. Now, I won't talk too much about it, but your Indigenous Australians prior to settlement demonstrated they understood that heat energy could be transferred through different mediums by making distinct choices in how they designed, chose materials and built traditional housings. In other words, the humpy. The simple humpy reflects so much scientific understanding. They go on to say here that we've got 9 distinct climates in Australia. Okay, according to Indigenous culture, they break it down. The desert's got 4, grassland has 5, subtropical has 4, and tropical has 3, and equatorial has 2. So we've got 9 distinct climates, and they are spread across different regions. Now, Indigenous Australians migrated across all of those regions. They had the science to know what to build, how to build it, and where to build it. So this is an excellent example of forms of energy, housing design, heat transfer, climate change, okay? Insulation is a fabulous component here. You can do all of these particular curriculum enhancements using Indigenous technology as your starting point. Next slide I want to point to talks about including models and theories and testable and refined over time. So when Europe was settled, traditional fire land management practices were prevented. Now we know that Indigenous cultures, some Indigenous cultures, had a practice of firing the land after they moved on from it. Now we know this has to do with seed germination. We know it's got to do with clearing up waste and a whole range of different hygiene, sanitation. But you can also link this to a study of bushfires. And if the traditional fire model was actually more scientific, more advanced, more preventable as a fire destruction model or a fire management model than the ones we currently adopt. And are we facing a bushfire crisis that could be informed by this traditional science? And we can look at advances in science, traditional ecological knowledge, tech, and we're seeing many land care organisations, redeploying, replanting the bush tucker. Okay, we're seeing ranger positions. We're seeing land scientists, job creation in many land care projects for Indigenous people who are actually reclaiming the land and addressing that whole notion of carbon dioxide pollution, ranging from fires and of course from mining and land degradation. And of course we look at the harsh tropical climates and the seasonal food sources. Again, Sam Sabora offers some excellent stimulus material here for us about the advanced scientific knowledge that Indigenous cultures had about toxins and how they can be removed from plants prior to consumption and the impact that had on Indigenous lives. This really comes to the fore at a time when we look at chemical sciences next term, when we're discovering more and more of our foods are actually killing us. Perhaps there's some science there that we as a society could tap into and could benefit from. On that note, again, I apologise that the actual Zoom session couldn't be posted. It's been a tech fail, somewhere between Cairns and Townsville. It's not actually downloading, allowing me to post this for you. So rather than wait till later in the week, I'm posting it as a surrogate copy. Please keep the questions coming via the forum. Thank you, and best wishes to all.